Norman Mailer wrote a great many books in his career, and in his lifetime he had a great deal to say about many topics. He had a great deal to say about himself. This episode of A Writer's Crime features some of the things Norman Mailer had to say about the night in 1960 when he stabbed his wife. Episode 4. What does Norman have to say? This episode does not represent the totality of what Norman Mailer said in his lifetime about the night he stabbed his wife. Rather, it's a selection of comments that he made. Because some of these selections are protected by copyright, I won't be replaying the actual audio. Instead, I'll be reading the excerpts, doing my modest impersonation of Norman Mailer. In the year 2000, when Mailer was in his late 70s, he was the subject of the PBS series American Masters. Over the course of an hour-long program, Mailer himself guides the viewer on a survey of his career, and along the way, major historical events from the 1950s through to the 1970s and 1980s. This is what Norman Mailer had to say in that program about the stabbing. He begins by referencing the unenthusiastic reviews that his novels The Deer Park and Barbary Shore had received in the 1950s. I was running into huge resistance to what I was writing, and I thought I had to become tougher. And so I began that long road which goes on for 20 or 30 years of learning how to fight, learning how to think in new ways, changing one personality for another. And in a certain sense, I became, if you will, a species of combat soldier in life, rather than in war. If there hadn't been this search for greater machismo in myself, then I probably would have ended up a victim of cancer. Certainly, my writing in that period is just obsessed with cancer, that everything in the scheme of things is seeking to give us cancer, because after all, what is cancer but a revolt of the cells? And I do think that probably this shift in my personality was my cancer cure, if you will. It was a matter of taking on risks that I'd been afraid of before. And so, I started getting into a few fights that I normally wouldn't have gotten into. And so I wasn't as nice as I thought I was. And dark, ugly, competitive streaks that were powerful in me began to come out. And of course, it accelerated, and it became more intense. And it finally culminated when in 1960, when I stabbed my first wife, Adele, with a penknife. It changed everything in my life. It's the one act I can look back on and I'll regret for the rest of my life. It happened. It happened out of the way I was living. There's no question about that. I didn't stab her because of my ideas. What happened is I was getting into more and more of a violent edge, and it happened. It made me recognize that I did not have a clear path through to philosophy, you see. And I've never had a coherent philosophical system since. If you live in a society where you can't feel your senses, then you have to go in for more extraordinary actions. To get back to some kind of real instinctive feeling, people tend to get more and more violent. In the American Masters program, Mailer appears to be speaking extemporaneously. If that is the case, that Mailer spoke without any kind of script, it would be fair to grant him some leeway to make the occasional misstatement, or to say something that, had he written it out, he might have chosen to say it differently. But it is worth looking closely at what he says and how he says it. Strangely, Mailer refers to Adele Morales as his first wife. That is not so. Mailer's first wife was his college sweetheart, a woman named Beatrice Silverman. They were married for 7 years and had a daughter together. Maybe we can just call this a slip of the tongue. In that excerpt, you heard Mailer admit to having stabbed his wife, and he calls it the biggest regret of his life. But there is also a notable distancing Mailer uses to describe the incident itself. It happened. And referring to the ugly competitive streaks in his personality, it accelerated, it became more intense, it culminated in him stabbing his wife. There is no personal responsibility in that phrasing, no acknowledgement that he had any kind of control over how he could have become tougher or more resilient in life. It just happened. Mailer says that the stabbing happened out of the way he was living, which could be said to be a true statement. But he doesn't mention that the way he was living at that time involved abusing alcohol, pills, and marijuana. Instead, he segues into more generalized statements about society and being divorced from one's senses. And when he says that in such a society, people tend to get more and more violent, it's not hard to hear Mailer saying, "You can hardly blame me, because everyone gets violent in a society that seeks to give you cancer." You're listening to the podcast A Writer's Crime, created and narrated by Tim Lemire. That's me. The musical theme of this podcast is the second movement of the Mandolin Concerto in C Major, RV 425, by Antonio Vivaldi. That piece, along with all the musical transitions in this podcast, are arranged and performed by guitarist-composer Raymond Gonzalez. You can find him online at raymondgonzalez.net. In January 1992, Norman Mailer appeared on the program Talking with David Frost. David Frost, as you may know, was a prominent British TV host and journalist. Frost is arguably best known in the United States for his interviews with then-former President Richard Nixon. In the interview, David Frost brings up a story involving a contemporary of Norman Mailer's, author William Styron. Reportedly, in a conversation with Mailer in the 1950s, Styron spoke about a man who had stabbed his mistress. Styron claimed that Mailer, at that time, expressed admiration for someone who had the guts to do that. Let me correct the record. I talked to Bill about it, and he has no recollection of saying that to the reporter who reported it. That's a very important point. Yeah, what I'd said, because we went over the conversation, is the fella who had stabbed his girlfriend, I at the time couldn't conceive of it. And I kept saying, how extraordinary to feel that intense and that emotional that you could literally stab someone you'd been living with. I was an innocent. And Styron and I were talking about it as innocence. I didn't admire it. There was no way I could admire the poor guy. Was absolutely broken who'd done it. You know, he didn't go to jail for it, but he was a shattered man and did very little with his life for the next few years that I lost track of him. I don't want to embarrass him by mentioning his name, but I mean, he certainly... You weren't going to say, oh boy, what an exciting thing to do. Look how that guy's thriving now. No. It wasn't that. I was just struck that how could anyone do it? And whatever number of years later, whatever it was, maybe 6, 8, 10 years later, there I was, doing it. And how could you do it? Well, someday I've got to write the book that explains how I did it, because it was a long road to get there. And, but, you know, no, there's no pride in it. It just made a total mess of... Was it, you once said, a decade's anger exploded in you? If I said it, I said, you know, you say these things and they're true the moment you say them. I don't know if I'd want to immortalize a remark like that. What's true now, Norman, about it? What's true now is that I did terrible injuries to a good woman. That I spoiled certain parts of my life forever. And that my kids have paid the greatest price for it. Because, you know, they're 7 years old, or whatever the age is, when they first find out. And I have children who run from, at this point, age 13 to age 43. They've all found out at different times, and it was a huge explosion in their lives. Those of them who were alive at the time. And it was a dreadful thing, and it did no good. I don't sit there and say, oh, I had that little moment. No. Well, was it the explosion of a moment? I mean, did it just happen to you? Do you know how it happened? Well, I've never talked about it on TV because we once had this a long time ago, that you don't talk about religion on TV and you don't talk about sex on TV. You remember, we had a fascinating conversation the first time we met. Yes, that's right. I do remember it. I remember it to this day. I've dined out on it. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think you can. This is so central, what you were just saying, that you can talk about it. I've talked about it abstractly. I'm not going to talk about it in detail because, frankly, with everything else, I'm selfish about it. I want to save it. Someday I really would like to write about it. There are key experiences that if you don't write about them and you don't talk about them, Hemingway's always saying don't talk about it. I think what he meant, at least what he means for me in it, is that if you keep an experience and you don't talk about it, and it's a crystalline experience, in other words, still very clear to you, the moment, still enormously clear to you, and you can beam a light through it from many an angle and get many a story, many a chapter of a novel. And writers are like squirrels. We collect those things that we need to get through a long writing winter or a decade or 3 decades. And so, yeah, the crystals, yeah. But if you talk about it and you explain it, you've used up that particular possibility in yourself to go in many directions from that. But do you understand it yourself now? Yeah, I think I understand it, and I don't have a terribly charitable view of myself in relation to it. I think but with everything else, it was a hideously stupid and wanton act. It was an unnecessary act. It was an unjustified act. So I don't like myself for it at all. I don't... It was ego, finally. That consists of those parts of the house that were strong and those parts where you're always shoring up the walls and taping the plaster together to keep it together. And let's say that's the weaker part of my house. That's the weakest part. So it's the thing in your life that the incident that you would rewrite if you had it to live all over again, most? If I had to do it over again, I would hope and believe I wouldn't do it over again, yeah. Because it was Rod McLeish who said, what all of Norman's friends can never reconcile is his gentleness with the violence in his work and in his life. But that's always true with writers. The people who are wildest in print are always the nicest when you meet them. Henry Miller, But you've been wild in your life as well. You've had violence in your own life as well. Well, so did Henry Miller. But what I'm getting at is that when you met Henry Miller, at least when he was 70, my God, he was the nicest man I'd ever met in my life. I mean, Henry Miller was just wonderful. He'd always tell you the truth. And he tells you in the gentlest possible way he could. He'd say, yes, Norman, you really made a big mistake over there if you were talking about something that hadn't happened the night before. Yeah, you really shouldn't have said that. But he'd say it in this kindly way that you didn't... Well, I mean, look at his writing. It's the guys who write these wonderfully sweet books who are absolute monsters. They're the ones who kick the wife and cuff the kids and have the dog shrinking from them in horror and so forth. Norman Mailer never did write that book about why he stabbed his wife or how it came to pass. Between the year 1992 and his death in 2007, Mailer had several books published, including his last novel, The Castle in the Forest. But there was no equivalent to O.J. Simpson's 2007 book, If I Did It. The magical crystals that Mailer refers to in this interview with Frost remained untapped. In 2013, Simon & Schuster published Norman Mailer, A Double Life by J. Michael Lennon, an emeritus professor of English who met Norman Mailer in the early 1970s and became friends with Mailer and his family. People may debate whether one's biography should be written by someone who is a close friend, but we concern ourselves here with a paragraph in the book, which Lennon identifies as Mailer speaking several months before his death.
Well, Adele and I had been getting into bigger and bigger games when I ran for mayor in '60 that it absolutely got her in a state of suppressed hysteria because she thought it was going to shatter our lives. What does she know about being a mayor, being a mayor's wife? What if I got elected? We had our children by then. We had Danielle, we had Betsy. Those were very important events for me in the 50s, Danielle and Betsy being born. And so we were getting along very badly, and we were getting into a kind of gotcha routine where each of us was doing something that was superior to the other. And so finally, I had this big party at which I was going to announce my coming out for mayor, and Adele was going nuts at the party, from my point of view. And finally, in a rage, I took out my penknife and stuck it into her with the idea of, here, you think you're tough, I'm tougher. It was madness. I was pretty drunk at the time and probably on pot. The idea was not to do her any damage, just to give her a nick or two, see? Damn it if I didn't nick her heart. She could have died from it. And of course, they took her to the emergency hospital, cut her open from the sternum virtually down to below the navel. So for years afterwards, she had this huge scar, and she'd sometimes show it at parties. This would give people the idea that I'd used a butcher knife, which is why Gore Vidal mentions a butcher knife.
It can be challenging to know where to begin with this statement. Lennon, to his credit, points out that any report of Gore Vidal saying that Mailer attacked his wife with a butcher knife cannot be located. Lennon suggests that Mailer may be confusing Gore Vidal with George Plimpton, who told Peter Manso for his book that Mailer attacked his wife with a kitchen knife. The more crucial part of Mailer's statement here is the suggestion that he meant only to nick his wife once or twice. If this were true, that implies that at the time Mailer stabbed his wife, he had awareness of what he was doing. He knew what he wanted to do. It could be argued that perhaps Mailer intended only to nick Adele, and when he came at her physically, he came too fast, and the knife in his hand went too deep. It's not unheard of for people who brought a loaded gun to an argument to say that they did so with the intention only of scaring or intimidating someone, not to shoot or kill them. But that is what they say after the fact. If what Mailer wanted was to nick Adele with a knife, and he was conscious of the fact that he wanted to do that, then why did he choose to do it at 4 a.m. on Sunday, November 20th? Why did he choose to do it after, by his own admission, he had been drinking and was probably on pot? And if you are recalling an event from the past and you cannot say for sure whether you were on pot or not, you were probably smoking too much pot. Norman Mailer, in making this statement, was talking to his official biographer and friend. If it were true that he didn't mean to stab Adele, why didn't he say this in 1960 or in 1992 talking to David Frost? Norman Mailer died in 2007. So if he made this statement to his biographer a few months before he died, that means he was 84 years old, recalling an event that took place 47 years earlier. It would be challenging to recall a happy event that took place that far back and once past. We only know what Mailer said. We don't know if he himself truly believed what he said, or whether he was saying something that he knew was going to be in his official biography. In the next episode of our podcast, Norman Mailer is arrested, stands before a judge, and insists that he is sane. You've been listening to A Writer's Crime with me, Tim Lemire. Tune in for our next episode, and thanks very much for listening.